evening, everybody. This is the day the Lord has made. We do rejoice and we're glad in it. We're grateful for it. I am so thankful to be on this wonderful venue once again, where we are collaborating, as I am the senior pastor of Life Builders Church, and we are collaborating with the wonderful ministry and the wonderful gift of Keys of Hope. And Keys of Hope is just a phenomenal work that they do regarding the area of mental health, which is so needed in this time. They do much more than that, but the emphasis for the time that we're spending is dealing with issues regarding mental health, especially for key leaders in this time of pandemic. The last few weeks have been phenomenal. Our speakers have been no less than pristine in their approach. They've been directly on target. And I want to applaud Keys of Hope for the wonderful job they've done in their selection of those individuals who would be presenting to us. And I know tonight will be nonetheless. Got a little allergy thing going, so that's why my voice is a little scratchy, but hey, it's still a great day. And I'm very thankful to be here. So I'm asking that as we prepare to get into this session, that you would, of course, mute all external noise. I know that the host will have you muted, but I want you to not be distracted. I want you to hear tonight what is going to be discussed. I'm going to turn it over to Lauren Capel of Keys of Hope, who's going to introduce our wonderful speaker for tonight. And I'm excited about what's about to take place. So without further ado, again, welcome to tonight's session. I think there's one more after this, and it's just been phenomenal. It has been phenomenal. So take it away, Lauren.
Thank you, Bishop. I just want to join with you in saying that I have been also empowered, even as a mental health professional from this series. Can never stop learning. So I have been enjoying all of the speakers. I'm actually going to be introducing the topic today, which is around trauma and how to deal with trauma and resilience during this time, which is definitely an important topic for key leaders. We know that all wounds are not visible wounds, and you might even during this pandemic had some wounds that have opened up for you as you had time to sit at home and reflect and not be busy. That you might have been dealing with some traumas, or maybe you've been experiencing trauma during this time. So trauma can manifest in different ways and have a major impact on your emotional and well-being in various aspects of your life. So trauma that is not addressed can be a heavy burden to manage without the right tools and supports and systems in place. But through the power of resiliency, restoring hope is possible. And so I'm going to turn this over to Ms. Tiara Sidnor-Diggs, because she is going to introduce our presenter, who is well-rounded and an expert in trauma. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Tiara, now to introduce our presenter for this evening.
Thank you, Lauren. Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to see everyone again, or welcome if this is your first time joining Keys of Hope Consultants, as well as Life Builders Church with Bishop Carrington. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for the evening. Dr. Candace Aston is an assistant professor of school psychology at Towson University. She also earned a master's degree in both child psychology and elementary education. Dr. Aston has years of experience working with urban populations in schools and in clinical settings. She completed her doctoral internship at Sarah Reed Children's Center, which provides intensive psychiatric services for children with significant trauma and mental health concerns. The focal point of her research has centered around culturally relevant social emotional interventions for racially diverse populations. Dr. Aston has extensive intervention experience and has published several journal articles on assessment and intervention practices with Black children. Now that I'm finished reading, I would like to introduce this beautiful soul. She's amazing. She's awesome. She's super smart, very engaging. You will not be disappointed this evening. We always encourage anyone who joins us to make sure that you lean in, ask questions, answer questions. I will be visible within the chat box. So if you have anything that you wish to share, or you have a question, or Dr. Aston says something that resonates with you, please feel free to participate in the chat box. I'll make sure that we articulate some of your thoughts to Dr. Aston, and I believe she'll also kind of be doing some interactive things with you as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Candace Aston.
Great. Well, thank you for that warm welcome. I'm excited to be here tonight and speak on trauma, which is not the sunniest topic, but I hope you walk away with feeling empowered to support people that have experienced trauma, as well as some strategies should you encounter people with traumatic backgrounds. So I'm going to just pull up some slides and we'll get started. Right. So my goal for everyone when they walk away from the presentation tonight is that you will be able to define and understand the impact of trauma, as well as recognize the importance of addressing mental health and Black communities, and the importance of really seeking support, not only for yourself, but for others. Right. So to start off, there's this video clip that I would like to play. And one thing that I want you to keep in mind is this idea of going from living to thriving. And I'm going to pull it up in 1 second. And I really think that this clip will summarize some of the issues that Black people as a whole face in regards to coming to terms with mental health, as well as seeking mental health supports.
So I look like NBA superstar James Harden. Was definitely the poorer version. I get hip hop superstar, Emmy Award winner, Donald Glover, AKA Childish Gambino. Yeah, that too, right? And last but not least, I get Curtis Jackson, AKA 50 Cent. Now, one of my goals is definitely to give Rich or Die Trying. I think Sally Mae is putting the emphasis on or die trying, right? But see, what I don't hear is, Phil, you look like somebody that lives with depression and anxiety. Phil, you look like somebody that was suicidal for 15 years, every day, 5 to 6 times a day. They don't say, Phil, you look like somebody that was driving on Interstate 95, wanting to crash your car to end your life. No, because see, here in America, when we think about mental health, we think about the homeless man who's walking the streets, talking nonsensically to themselves. We think about the white celebrity who takes their life via suicide. We think about the white mass murderer who goes into a high school and takes the lives of innocent children. Or it's usually your president who loves to tweet venom from the hip. But see, rarely does the conversation speak of a father of 2 kids, someone who possesses a master's in exercise science, a master's in social work, somebody pursuing a doctorate. Rarely is it a person of color. Rarely is it a Black man like myself, until now, because Black mental health matters. Now, you may be asking yourself, what is Black mental health, and why is it differentiated amongst racial and ethnic lines? Black mental health are the individual and collective experiences that influence the wellness of a community. Trauma is the biggest influencer of Black mental health. We're talking about historical trauma, slavery, Jim Crow, the civil rights movement, the Tuskegee experiment, up until present day trauma. When you see somebody that looks like you get killed in their home, rest in peace, Botham Jean. When you see somebody who's living with mental wellness issues get killed by the police, rest in peace, Laquan McDonald of Chicago, Illinois. Or when you see somebody that looks like you get killed by somebody that looks like you. Rest in peace, Triple X Tentacion. See, when we talk about trauma, trauma is unique to the individual, and I'm no different. There were 3 impactful traumatic situations that I've experienced in my life outside of the genetic predisposition because my grandmother lived with schizophrenia. I hearken back to being in 8th grade, 13 years of age. On the way to school, my mother has a nervous breakdown. She's crying. She's pulling at her clothes and her hair. She's cursing. I felt helpless because I couldn't help her I couldn't help myself. And see, I was expected to continue to go into school that day and achieve. It's funny, when I first started telling this story, I told my mother, listen, I'm telling the story of when you had a nervous breakdown. And she said, Phil, that didn't happen. Now, I know I'm getting older. I have a few grays, right? But I swear I remember that. And then she called me a week later and she said, Phil, I didn't know you remembered that. As if I wouldn't remember the most traumatic situation that I've experienced in my life. And that typically happens. We're often expected to just continue on because we are so resilient as a people, because we do survive, and we've survived for hundreds of years. And I was expected to survive and go into school that day and perform. And I did, because like many of us, I learned how to suppress my emotions and my feelings. But what if I didn't? What if I went into school and I started arguing with peers and fighting? What if I started arguing with the teachers? What if I did criminalistic behaviors within the community? Would I be deemed incorrigible and unable to be in the school setting, in the community setting? Or would anybody care that I just experienced this traumatic situation that has impacted me? Fast forward to my 12th grade year, 17 years of age, January 2001. My mother said, Phil, come downstairs. She said, Phil, your brother Bobby died. And I started crying. That was probably the only healthy coping skill that I had at the time, right? Because being a product of the hip hop culture, hip hop tells me when somebody dies, you either go out and get some liquor or you go get a rest in peace tattoo. Well, I wasn't old enough to drink. That would happen once I got to college, right? But I went out and I got this rest in peace tattoo. As if that was going to do something, if that was going to take away the pain of losing a primary relationship. It didn't. And people ask me, Phil, well, how did your brother die? See, the opioid epidemic is popular now. But in the black community, in the hip hop community, especially amongst black male, it's always existed. He was one who liked to use codeine and Xanax. I don't know what he was trying to cope with. I will never know. I went to school that Monday because I didn't have anybody to say, Phil, stay home. Because my mother was going through it because she just lost her only child. And I went to school feeling all of this emotion. And I remember it like yesterday. I was sitting in computer class. Miss Williams, my computer teacher, came up to me, and I don't know what she said. She said, Phil, she could have said, Phil, what was the score of the Eagles game last night? I let her have it. I blacked on her. I cursed her out. Why? Because I had all this built up anger, all this built up rage. Because see, when we're talking about depression and anxiety for black men especially, it doesn't look like somebody laying in bed for 6 and 7 days on end. No, it manifests itself through anger and rage. I ended up getting suspended that day. And Ms. Williams and I were able to laugh at the situation years later because I was able to cope with it and understand what I was feeling. But again, it was a moment in time that impacted my life. My third and final story happened at Bloomsburg University in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. Again, we remember traumatic situations, and I remember it like it was yesterday. I call it the Jew story, right? Because when I go fill out job applications and it says, have you ever been convicted of a crime? As long as it doesn't say misdemeanor or felony, I can ignore it if it says that. But if it says, have you ever been convicted of a crime, I have to check it off. And then I put Well, it all started with a cup of juice. And then the employers, they laugh like, oh man. And I laugh like, ha, ha, ha. That's my life. So the juice story is, I was coming from the gym to go get me something to eat. I got my food. I paid for it, emphasis on pay. And you know how you go to McDonald's, they give you a cup and you can go to the fountain and get whatever drink you want. And I did that, and I tasted it to see if it was watered down. But see, when you go to a predominantly white institution like Bloomsburg University, it seems like they have all the minorities' names on a list. And the school police officer said, Phil, that's stealing. Mind blown. And me having this anger, this frustration that's built up over years of trauma, and me not being able to express myself in a healthy way, I blacked on her just like I did Miss Williams. Unbeknownst to me, that would lead to 20 plus charges. I ended up going to jail that night. I ended up getting expelled from school. I ended up doing a weekend in jail because, listen, they say you'll get judged by a jury of your peers. With the average age in that community being 60 and over, it wasn't going to be a jury of my peers. But I needed that experience. I needed it. And I needed it because it told me that, Phil, I have to do something different. I ended up appealing to get back into Bloomsburg University, and people knew me, so people wanted me back. And so I got back, and I was focused. One day, my psychology professor, Dr. Cambone Camara, God bless the dead, he said, Phil, come talk to me about anything, anytime. And I took him up on that. I went and talked to him, not to talk about school. I went to talk to him about a young lady I had been courting, right? And I wanted to understand, why didn't she want me? So I went to his office. I'm like, listen, I bought her sneakers. I took her to the movies. I took her to dinner. Well, my mom took her to dinner and all those things because I didn't have a job. Thanks, Mom. But he said to me, Phil, in life, you change to get something or to keep something. And I'm like, man, what are you talking about? Little did I know that would become my mantra, that I realized I had to change. I had to work on my wellness so I can be whole. It took approximately 10 years, because that's the average length of time that they say somebody who lives with mental wellness issues, that's the time that it takes for them to come to grips with it and to seek treatment. For Black people, I think it's much longer. And so within those 10 years, I've been on medication, which quelled the suicidal ideations. They're no more. I go to therapy every week. Hi, Dr. Val. It's been so critical for me in my wellness because I decided to go from living to thriving. To my Black brothers and sisters, you too deserve to go from living to thriving.
And in that video, I think it does a great job of kind of seeing one person's journey and journey in terms of coming to terms with their trauma, as well as seeing how trauma can lead to some outward behaviors that if that trauma is unresolved, it can really impact us in many ways. And it could end up in us feeling kind of worthless or feeling depressed, but also in many people, we see it through anger. And there's so much research literature that has looked at juvenile justice as well as the prison system. And in terms of the presence of the people that are there, how they endorse trauma. And I believe it was somewhere around 95% of the people involved in both juvenile justice as well as prison have expressed exposure to significant traumas in their life. And fortunately, the man in the story, he was able to really seek support and, find a way to kind of manage some of those early life traumatic experiences and turn it around in a positive way. And that is my goal for kind of everyone today, is to walk away with understanding really the importance of trauma, how it can show up in people's lives in different ways, and how important it is that supports come in. And supports can come from a therapist, it can come in from a church member, it can come in from a friend, someone, and also what's kind of in a lot of the trauma literature is this idea that all it takes is one significant adult or one significant positive relationship to really change the trajectory of trauma and the impact of trauma. And each of you could really be that one person for someone. As a therapist, I worked a lot with people who had a lot of trauma, and sometimes it's easy to get caught up in some of the outward behaviors, but once you peel back the layers, you can really see that this is really at the root of it is trauma. So in terms of Black mental health, there's 4 major barriers to Black mental health and to people in the Black community really reaching out to seek mental health supports. And the first one I have listed here is this idea of mistrust of professionals, the healthcare system. And this is, it stems back to history and the history of research and how it has been done wrong with Black Americans, as well as this idea that I can't trust outsiders, people outside of my community, people that don't look like me. But on the other end of that, in terms of the encouraging news, there are growing numbers of Black professionals in mental health, both psychologists, therapists, counselors. There is growing representation, and at the end of the presentation, you'll see some links to where you can actually have a directory to Black male therapists as well as Black female therapists, if that is something that's really important, if that cultural match is something important in terms of seeking support. The next barrier that I have here is the stigma of mental health. And I can speak personally that I have encountered a lot of people in my own family who, when talking about mental health, is viewed as a weakness. It's viewed as not being strong, or we're almost conditioned to say that, you know, life is hard and we normalize it. So then we think that we're just to live with it being hard. And that's why I really liked in the video when he talked about going from just surviving to kind of thriving. And part of that is taking away the stigma, changing the narrative of mental health. Depression, being someone who deals with depression does not mean that you're weak, does not mean that you're strong. It can really be a sign of strength to acknowledge that, hey, I'm struggling here and I need support. That alone should be viewed as a strength.
Dr. Essen, someone in the comment box just made a point that trauma also just shows up in people regardless of background, economic status, or education as well.
Yes, definitely. It shows up, and even kind of there's also a lot of history when they talked about that historical trauma, just kind of being born into a situation where trauma kind of can be present in kind of a family line that has been shown, kind of generational impact of trauma. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. In terms of the third barrier here, religion. Sometimes mental illness can be viewed as a test of your faith. So people are hesitant about seeking treatment or therapy because they're wondering, is there a place for prayer as well as therapy? And what has been shown, and there are a lot of Christian counselors and therapists, that there can be space for both. They can both coexist. One doesn't cancel out the other. You can have your faith, you can have your prayer, but you can also seek help and seek outside supports. And the last barrier I have here is this fear of criminalization, legal repercussions. If I seek mental health or if I say I have a mental health disorder, what would that mean? Will people, will I be a target? What will the people at my child's school say if they know I live with mental illness? And that's a real fear. But the good news in terms of the counter that is that there has really been increased advocacy for Black mental health and for how to really change that narrative that being someone who or struggling with mental health means that you can't parent or things like that. So there's a lot of supports out there that probably haven't weren't there 10 years ago. So we're kind of in a good place in terms of pushing Black mental health awareness. And even from a national level, celebrities, as well as important figures kind of in society have really stepped out and said, like, I am someone who struggles with mental health, to kind of just make it visible. And I think that's the importance of it. Trauma can often be invisible. It can be something that it's almost like this invisible backpack that you wear, and it goes everywhere you go. It impacts your beliefs, it impacts your thoughts, but no one can kind of see it. They don't know why you do what you do. But a lot of that is what you're carrying in kind of this invisible backpack. So through therapy and other supports, you can learn how to repack that backpack with some positive coping strategies and different ways of being, thinking, feeling. All right, so at the kind of basis of our talk today is to discuss what is trauma, what's the impact of trauma. And one thing that I think is important is to differentiate between stress and trauma, because they're sometimes used interchangeably. And stress is a normal part of life in smaller quantities. Sometimes stress can be a motivating factor. If we, have something to do at work and we feel a little stressed, we're going to kind of get it done. It's going to motivate us, prompt us to do it. However, when we have too much stress and it overwhelms our ability to kind of cope with that in a healthy way, that's when we would say trauma might be present. And trauma is the inability of an individual or community to, like I said, respond in a healthy way to an acute or chronic stress. And I'll define those in the next slide. But like I said, it's what we use to say that a stressful event has overwhelmed and thereby compromised the health and welfare of a person in their community. So in terms of the two primary types of trauma, acute is referred to as simple trauma, one traumatic major event. So this could be a car accident, this could be a natural disaster. It's not something that you're constantly being exposed to day in and day out. It's not happening over and over again. Whereas chronic and complex is multiple traumatic experiences occurring. So this could be, chronic could be living in a household with a parent with a substance abuse disorder. And every day, day in and day out, you're impacted by that experience, and you live with it over time. And because it's something that's repeated and long-term, it's much more difficult to kind of really move past, and it takes a lot more work to kind of work through some of that chronic or complex trauma. To kind of illustrate this idea of stress versus trauma, there's this palm tree analogy. So if you think about the palm trees in Florida, they often endure a lot of winds, and that could be like your stress. So there's a lot of stress of the different winds, and they could be acute or chronic. It could be one big storm that rolls through or several different storms, and the trees bend and sway. However, at some point, that tree might snap. And at the point that the tree snapped and no longer could withhold or could no longer stand those winds, that's when we would say trauma really comes to play, because that tree could no longer deal with the stress that it was being forced to kind of go through. And trauma itself is not necessarily the part of the tree that's snapping or the broken tree. It's really the fact that the tree could no longer sustain the stress that it was under.
Dr. Aston, we have a comment from Marlena, one of the participants. She said that my life has been a living trauma that I became accustomed to, not knowing I'm sorry, Marlena, I'm messing up your words, not knowing most of my life what was taking place. After my breakdown and diagnosed, have had a hard time working with my culture.
Yeah, I think this really speaks to the barriers and the things that as a minority or as a Black woman or a Black male who is faced with mental health, you kind of struggle with that. And I kind of applaud you for acknowledging that and speaking that. That takes bravery to stand up and say, I am someone who has been exposed to trauma and experienced trauma. I encourage you to keep working through it. What we know about trauma is that unresolved trauma is going to keep showing up in our lives in different ways. And I think you're really taking the first step to acknowledge that it's here and I don't want it here anymore. So it sounds like you really want to move to that thriving space. So I encourage you to kind of take note of the things that we talk about throughout this presentation. And I hope you walk away with some strategies to kind of really mediate this idea of kind of how do I move forward with this information? How do I get, to a place of wellness? All right. So one thing that is that was always interesting to me when I first started kind of learning more about trauma is that it can actually change the brain volume. So they have looked at brain scans. Neuropsychologists and neuroscientists have looked at scans of different brains, and for those of children who have been exposed to significant neglect or traumas, they actually saw a reduce of brain volume. And that alone can lead to cognitive issues, mental health issues, increased likelihood to engage in risky behavior. So that alone, to know that just toxic stress for a 3-year-old. So if a 3-year-old was born in a chaotic environment, exposed to neglect, that alone could reduce the brain volume that they have. So we often think of trauma as kind of this external thing that, okay, it happened, but to know that it can actually change our biology, our makeup. The next phenomenon that I wanted to talk about in terms of this idea of how trauma can change our brains is this idea of fight, flight, or freeze. And what this relates to is an area of our brain called the amygdala. And what the amygdala does is activate when we sense fear, and it kind of gets us into this survival mode. So it's almost like if you're walking, you see a bear, your amygdala is going to be triggered, and then you're going to go into fight, flight, or freeze. You're either going to get ready to kind of take on that bear, or you're going to flee, or maybe you'll be frozen because you're just overwhelmed. So maybe you become numb. And what happens with people with trauma is that it's like they're always seeing a bear. It's like they're hyper vigilant. They're always kind of on edge. So what this might look like is, someone who you walk up to and kind of maybe touch their shoulder and they became really startled or had a big response. That could be a possible trauma response because their brain has now been trained to kind of always be on alert, always be on fight or flight survival mode. And it's something that I work with when I'm working with children in the schools. Sometimes I'll hear teachers say like, nothing happened, just a pencil dropped, or I don't know what happened, I just took the paper out of their hand. And they don't realize that trauma really changes the reactions. And I often have to kind of work with them to understand that this is a trauma response. This is not a behavioral issue within themselves. This is really, how do we change the way we interact with them in order to be more trauma sensitive? All right, so the next thing that I wanted to discuss is the ACEs study, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And this study is what helped us know the most of what we know about the impact of trauma. And it was a longitudinal study. It looked at some participants over the span of 10 years, and it wanted to see if early exposure to trauma led to certain outcomes or increased the likelihood that someone might have certain physical, emotional problems, they might have health problems. How is trauma going to show up 10 years later? And if you have more traumas, does that increase the likelihood that you're going to have even more issues that show up later on? So here is the survey here. And I think it's helpful. I remember sitting in my graduate program and when learning about trauma, my professor kind of said, take out a pen and I want you to take this quiz. And the reason for it is because by understanding your own personal things that you carry with, it really will help you in your own work with others to really kind of have a good self-awareness of your own things that might have happened in your life, as well as checking in to see if maybe you yourself would be someone who could benefit from some supports to kind of work through some early experiences. So I will ask you all to kind of jot down a yes or a no or a tally mark as I go through these 10 questions. And when we go to the next slides, you'll see that how the study worked is they look to see how many yeses, so how many ACEs one person has endorsed. And based on their the numbers that they endorse, so maybe 4 of these questions you answer yes, they have shown that people with 4 or more yeses are more likely to have these things occur or these things happen. So I will read through these 10, and if you can just kind of jot down yes or do a tally, and then keep that in mind as we work through the next couple slides. So the first thing is answer these questions based on your first 18 years of life. So the first one we have here is, did a parent or other adult in the household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? So if that is a yes, you can tally mark or however you want to kind of keep a running count for yourself. The next one, did a parent or other adult in the household often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? The third one, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you in a way, in a sexual way that was unwanted? You would enter yes for that. Did you often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Number 5, did you often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you, or your parents used substance abuse while they were taking care of you, or did not take you to the doctor if you needed it? Number 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? Number 7, and this is specific to your mother or stepmother or someone else who stood in that role, did they often push, grab, slap, or have something thrown at them? Or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or a knife? Number 8, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or used street drugs? Number 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? And the last one is, did a household member go to prison? So after thinking about those questions, and this is often done in settings in terms of mental health settings and trying to get an idea of someone's exposure to trauma, and it kind of gives an idea of, treatment options. If someone does have significant trauma exposure, then there are specific therapies that can target trauma. There's trauma-focused CBT. There's narrative therapy that work on kind of discussing your story and kind of reframing it in a more positive way. So I know it can sometimes even be difficult thinking about these things and reflecting on it. We'll go through some of the impact of trauma based on these ACEs scores, and we'll get to kind of, we'll build up to how we get to resiliency and how we get to, despite these things, how do we still kind of move forward and get to a positive place or help others get to a positive place. All right. So the first slide here, in terms of looking at the results of the study, talk about those who had 4 or more ACEs. So they said yes to at least 4 of those questions on that questionnaire. So what they have found is they are more likely to smoke, 2 times more likely to smoke, 7 times more likely to become an alcoholic, 10 times more likely to inject street drugs, and 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. 6 or more live 20 years less. So that's really kind of important to think about how it can really take years off of someone's life just dealing with all these traumatic experiences. Depression is also seen. I wanted to touch on the impact of learning just because I am a school psychologist and I work a lot with kids, but they have found that students that have a lot of ACEs or endorse high ACE scores are more likely to be placed in special education, more likely to be suspended. They have higher rates of high school graduation, lower grade point average. They score lower on cognitive assessments. And then here you can see in terms of health outcomes. And the dark blue bar is if someone said they had 1 ACE, and the gray bar is if someone said they had 4 or more. And as you can see, there's this dose response. So the more ACEs that one endorses, the more likelihood they're at risk to have these health issues present. And here kind of is just a visual talking about that dose response. So the more ACEs, the more likely it is predicted that you will suffer from disease, addiction, or even a shorter lifespan. And I'll touch briefly on the expanded ACEs study. So there was a follow-up and they said, hey, we want to know if there's any difference with urban populations. The first study was not done specifically in urban areas. So this one was done in Philadelphia, and they added something to that original checklist. They added racism because they really felt that that alone is trauma. And so here I have defined as what race-based traumatic stress looks like. And I think if we think about the past year and think about police brutality, we think about just the things that have been occurring in regards to Black Americans in the United States in the past year. Racial trauma is so real. And like those other traumatic markers, racial trauma has also been seen to predict mental health issues as well as health problems later on. So just experiencing discrimination alone can increase your likelihood to have some mental health problems later on. And here are just some trauma symptoms, and trauma symptoms look different for everyone. It could be anxiety, it could be worry, it could be sadness, depression, it could be negative thoughts about themselves, increased sensitivity. So these are just a few. Like I said, it can show up in many ways. It can show up as anger, but what's important is to get to those kind of lower layers, to peel back those layers and really see what's the core of the issues that person is experiencing. So I said at some point I would get to the good part, and the good part is that resiliency is a big thing. And in the video, the speaker talked about resiliency and how that is often used as a reason why Black people don't seek mental health, because there's this idea that we're resilient, we're gonna make it anyway. And that's true, we are resilient people. I cannot say that more. However, if we pair some strategies to even bolster that resiliency that we already have kind of ingrained in us, we can really improve the outcome even more. So resiliency is the idea that good outcomes in spite of serious threats to adaptation or development. So despite having some ACEs, despite having 4, 5, 6 or more, you can still bounce back. And I'll kind of share in terms of when I first took my ACEs quiz, I endorsed 6. And I remember thinking like, wow, 6. What's the outcome for me? What's coming? But then I thought about some of the things in my life that helped serve as protective factors as well as build resilience. And the church was one of them, as well as family support. And I had a lot of other supports that kind of just were around, like sports. I had, community involvement through church. So there was all of these things. And I think as kind of thinking about how you or organizations can support resiliency, you can think of the 4 R's. And the first one is realizing the impact of trauma. So recognizing that this is a real thing and it impacts people in many ways. Recognize the signs. So understand what it might show up as. Responds to someone by integrating knowledge about trauma, procedures, practices. So changing your practices to really be trauma informed. And then the last R is resist. So seeks to actively resist re-traumatizing someone. And what that means is if you have someone who maybe experienced physical abuse or something in their past, kind of understanding that boundaries is probably big for them, and really working to kind of make sure you maintain the boundaries. Maybe that's not someone that you can just go up and kind of touch on the shoulder because you really don't want to re-traumatize them. And in terms of how the church can support resiliency, once again, recognize the prevalence of trauma, the impact on trauma on the developing brain, as well as some of those consequences, those health consequences are really big. Sometimes we talk about the symptoms, we talk about ADHD, we talk about obesity, but we're not talking about the underlying causes of some of those things. Some of those things are the outward kind of things that we can readily see, but behind that, what's leading to obesity? It could be some trauma. The next thing I have, the third bullet, is potential for healing and the human capacity for resilience and the importance of mental health treatment and being an advocate and really advocating for those that have exposure to trauma to really seek help. And I have down at the bottom, adopt a trauma-informed lens. And what that means is moving away from thinking like, why did someone behave that way? Or why did someone engage in that behavior? And moving towards what happened to them that caused them to engage in that behavior. When we move to that part, we're looking at it through a trauma-informed lens. And as someone who deals with trauma and helps people with trauma, there is a cost of caring. It's important to recognize vicarious trauma and how that can affect our personal lives. So if you are someone who's working to support others with trauma, know that it's important to take care of yourself as well throughout that. You think about on the plane, you have to give yourself oxygen before you can give it to your child. So you want to really make sure that you're still taking care of yourself. And then this slide is how you can seek support or seek support for others. So prayer, religion, I think that's a definitely protective factor that can support and can help. Along with that, therapy is really important. I put it 3 times because it's super important. And I'll say that therapy is work. So I'm saying therapy, that's good. And it is, but know that it's work and know that it'll take time. So even though if in the beginning you tried one session, try it again. And sometimes you have to try several different therapists until you find that right match. Practice self-care, learn to be aware and recognize your own symptoms of possible trauma if you're someone who has experienced that, and know when you're not okay and you might need to okay, something's going on. I need help right now, and being willing to seek the help when you need it. And other things is to make a list of things that might be triggering and find ways to kind of how you're going to cope when those triggers come up. So some common concerns that come up in terms of therapy and religion is therapy will conflict with my religion. I don't want to be judged by my church members. I won't find a therapist that also can take into account my faith. And this slide says reframing of beliefs, and reframing is a common strategy in therapy, cognitive behavior therapy. And it's about kind of how we change our beliefs to kind of reword it so we could change our thoughts, change our feelings. So 3 ways to reframe those things I just spoke on is I can talk to a therapist and God. Therapy is a supplement to my religion, and God works through everyone, including therapists. And I'll close today with this scripture. So this story was about a man who lay helplessly by the pool. He couldn't kind of make it in there to get healed by the angels. And then Jesus saw him lying and asked him the question, do you want to be healed? And for me, that's what I just kept thinking of. And I think that's a question that people who struggle with mental health really kind of grapple with. Do you want to be healed? And part of that is, how do we get to healing? And I really think that that is about us having our faith, but also moving forward to kind of think about additional supports that we might need. And one of those is really therapy and getting our mental health in order and in a healthy place. So kind of, if we want to be healed, what do we need to do? We have to do something about it. So I think about faith without works, right? So that will be kind of my closing story that kind of came to me when I was working on this. So
Dr.
that, yes.
Ashton, could you talk about what help looks like when people are reaching out? Because I think sometimes people are very confused about who does what. So when it comes to like your Dr. Ashton, your background is psychology. Lauren and I are licensed clinical social workers, and then you have licensed clinical what is that? I can't think of it, practitioners or LCPCs are the credentials. So would you kind of be able to shed a little bit of light on that when we talk about people like seeking help? Sometimes the first step is, I don't even know who to even turn to or talk to. So if you can kind of talk about that, that would probably be helpful.
Yeah, and I just moved to this slide. So if you see, the first slide is, if you are looking for a therapist, if you're a Black woman and you're like, I want a Black therapist for myself or for your daughter or something like that, that's that first link. And you can find practitioners. And like Ms. Tiara was speaking to, you have psychologists, which that is what I am. And we really do the same things as a licensed counselor, a licensed social worker, in terms of the therapy side of things. One thing that's a little bit different from psychology is that we do a little bit more with assessment in terms of making more clinical diagnosis, as well as we can do testing to kind of, if there was a learning difficulty, we could give cognitive assessments. We would do screeners to kind of really look at the different types of anxiety and how that might show up in different people. But if someone has an LPC, a social worker, a clinical social worker, or a PhD, a PsyD, all of those, we all basically do the same thing. But I would start with looking at the therapy for Black girls, the Black men. Also, this fourth link, Psychology Today. You can go to that, and it has a large database of therapists across the United States. You can click the city you want to get a therapist in, the town, then you can click the ethnic background that you want from your therapist. Then you can even pick the things you want your therapist to specialize in. So if you want, I need someone who specializes in depression, but also specializes in Christian counseling. You can click both of those boxes, and the people that specialize and meet your criteria will show up in a list. And I think that's a really helpful way of kind of shopping around to find your kind of specialty, kind of, what am I looking for? I need someone with trauma. I also want someone who's African-American, and I want someone who resides in Canton. That's a close commute. You can find it. So that fourth link, Psychology Today, you can really pick and choose, as well as you can get their bio, the psychologists, and it's psychologists, counselors, social workers. They'll have their bio, their picture, everything. So you can kind of have a little bit more information to make an informed decision of who you would like to be your therapist, instead of just kind of calling an agency and kind of just hoping that it's a good fit. You can actually, do a little bit more homework on it.
And for some of our viewers who are here with us now, or who may eventually watch the recording, who are in fact in leadership positions, could you kind of talk about even what that may look like? Because in a couple of our series, we've kind of addressed how sometimes it's a lot of weight that comes with being a leader. And because most leaders regardless of the capacity that you lead in, whether you're the leader of your church or a synagogue or whatever it is, and then you're leader of your household, or you may have leadership roles within your job or position. Sometimes it may be difficult. So would you be able to even talk about like what that process maybe look like, or what are some strategies for people who feel like they're the ones where everyone dumps on them? How do we support them in making sure that they also get the help that they need as well?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the idea of kind of the mask situation on the airplane. So self-awareness is so key. So if you are someone who has their own things that they have personally gone through, and then you're trying to listen to everyone else's things, and they're kind of bringing their stuff to you, it can be really difficult. It can be kind of a mesh. It can kind of become a mix of what you got going on, what they got going on. So I would say a good step is to make sure that you are in a healthy space of well-being, mental health, all of that. Like, get you in order before you can really be an aid to others. The other thing is, once you are in order, you do have to continually practice self-care, practice kind of when like, okay, this is a lot. I need to kind of figure out some more self-care. How can I take care of myself by taking care of others? And I think that's a common thing if we think even culturally in the Black community, when we talk about those stigmas and things of we're trying to take care of everyone, and we don't take a second to take care of ourselves first. So I would just really advocate to take care of yourselves first before you can be a help to other people. And then as you move forward, like having a good idea of resources. Sometimes if you're not a therapist and that's not your wheelhouse, active listening, listen to them, and then say, well, here is a direction I would point you into the path, because it sounds like you're struggling with some trauma, some past trauma, and I really think that you can benefit from counseling. And I think even by being in leadership and encouraging others to do counseling with, being in the church and that being kind of sometimes a stigma, I think that alone, where if you're someone who went to someone at church and said, I'm struggling with this, and they said, try therapy, and almost is like, oh, I didn't think that was okay. And it kind of dispels the myth that you can't do therapy in church together.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely.
Alrighty, so that is all kind of I had for today. Thank you all for participating, and I hope all of you that have a chance to watch the video take away something that is important to kind of your own personal life, as well as how you support or help others. So my contact information is there. If I can be of support in any way, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Dr. Aston. Did anyone have any questions, any further questions, or just any thoughts that may have resonated with them? We can take this time. Or Bishop, I'm not sure if you're nearby, if you had any comments or any last words of encouragement, that you do so well.
Hello, this is Pastor Ken Baker. I'm in California, and my daughter is she's actually working on her thesis in art therapy, and so we've talked about the different modalities, the different ways of therapies, and I think what struck me is that she's in an area where, as you probably know, there aren't many African American females, but she's getting her master's in art therapy, and then I think also in family counseling. But it's a unique area of therapeutic expression and the things she's been learning, and that she actually does with children around using art as a way of helping them through the trauma. And as you can imagine, here in the Bay Area with the pandemic and other things that's going on, dealing with elementary school children and the stories that she tells me about, but using art as a way of helping them is another coping skill. So it's just interesting to me that I don't hear a lot about our art therapy as a way of healing or coping.
Yeah, and I know Miss Sierra, we both have worked in Baltimore City public schools, and I know working one-on-one with the kids, they always love when I bring in art or even storytelling, ways for them to tell their story. And I think if we think culturally, that kind of goes back to some cultural characteristics in terms of how we like to express ourselves in creative ways. So yeah, I think that I'm glad she's entering our field. We need more. So I wish her luck on her journey.
And also to Pastor Baker's point, even for adults, art therapy is amazing. Like we've seen, coloring books are very popular, and not just with the children. You'll find adults pulling out their crayons and their color pencils, and they have adult coloring books, or just even drawing, or story, like you said, storytelling, writing stories, or even through music expression, other forms of art, so even dance. This is a way to express themselves. And again, I think as we are breaking the stigma and having more open discussions around, mental health and wellness and what that looks like, we can be creative, because I think the media and culturally, we always had one thought of what therapy looks like, or what it means to heal yourself. When you're sitting in front of someone and they have a pencil and they're looking at you and you're looking at them all intense, which works for some people. Some people like that dynamic. But then there's so many other different ways that we can nurture ourselves and take care of ourselves. Even as we talk about just the idea of religion, if prayer and, sitting and meditating and those types of things is your thing, like there's so many different creative ways to, support mental health. So I thank you, Pastor Baker, for sharing that. I really do. And it looks like we have someone in the chat box wanted to speak on the power of prayer during the process for me. So yes, that's a participant was saying the power of prayer. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, again, prayer is definitely something that people connect to. Dr. Ashton, did you kind of want to again talk about it? And kind of mentioned it during the presentation, but again, if you wanted to kind of touch base with that and how it can go hand in hand with the therapeutic part as well.
Yep, but I think she was saying that she wanted to share her experience with it.
Oh, sure.
Yes.
Yep.
Hi, everyone. This is Melina again.
Yes.
Through this process, I lived a life where I was sexually traumatized when I was younger, but it was pleasurable, so I didn't understand that it was a traumatic experience until I was 15. And by a lot of choices and things that took place my entire childhood was traumatic. Had a teenage pregnancy, had the family support there. When I got to the point of the breakdown, when I couldn't take anymore, started going to therapy, to hospitals. And for me, I was like, God, where are you? I want to see you now. That's the one person that through all of everything I've been through, that could have only got me through this and to the point that I'm still alive. And through that process, having therapists, having family, having support, but God has been showing me step by step, I am here every way. And it's times when I am just speaking out loud, like, I need you now. I am going to walk this direction. I am going to go the wrong direction because the strength is not there. So I think that even through the mental process, if it's even spoken more about in the church, the strength of prayer and coming together, that generational curses and the things that we are going through are going to be stopped. And I know that I'm allowing my story to be told and not hiding it, because I went through it for a purpose. He didn't get me this far for nothing. So just with prayer and everything else, I know for sure in speaking on it that it does make a drastic difference as well.
Absolutely.
Yes, I co-sign that 100%. I think prayer is so important. And I think kind of just bringing it back to kind of having that solid foundation, that relationship with God, and then using that as your foundation, and then seeking additional supports as need be, but really keeping that as your foundation.
And I just want to thank you for being brave and courageous, because as you stated, oftentimes we don't talk about these things, and as difficult as they can be, we often find that through our own liberation, through our own ability to share these stories, that not only do we liberate ourselves and we begin to heal ourselves, and it doesn't become a secret. But then also other people, you encourage other people, you empower other people, you uplift other people to say, you know what, I can talk about this too, and I can get some healing as well. So I truly appreciate you just being transparent. And again, just courageous, because again, it takes a lot to share, especially with a circle of strangers. But we totally appreciate it. And we know that, someone, I'm sure, will be touched by your story and will continue to be touched by your story. And, I just pray and hope that, you will continue on your journey as well. So I thank you for that. Did anyone else have any thoughts or any questions, or even if something just kind of came to you that you just wanted to share, or again, something that resonated with you, or even just around just general like self-care, taking care of yourself. We all know, and sometimes when we give these presentations, we are aware that everyone has not had a traumatic experience, but at the same time, we all experience some component of mental health and just still need to take care of ourselves. So even if trauma hasn't necessarily knocked on your door, again, just really emphasizing the importance of, just daily rituals and routines of taking care of yourself. Even as Dr. Ashton mentioned early on in the presentation, just around stress. So again, maybe you didn't experience trauma, but sometimes we are, especially in the midst of this pandemic, we're experiencing a lot of stress. And so again, just the importance of like daily routines, self-care practices, prayer, art therapy, talk therapy, and some of the other, methods that they have now. It's just very important. And then also to mix it up. Dr. Ashton, could you talk about that just a little bit? Because we do still have some time, but what it looks like to maybe mix it up, because sometimes I think people fall out of therapy because it gets old and stale. And so how can people just even be advocates for themselves if they decide that they do want to take that step? And sometimes it can be intimidating if you're sitting across from a doctor and you want to say, you know what, we've been doing this for 3 months, I think I want to try something different. So what does that look like?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to understand that you and your therapist are a team. It's not kind of this power hierarchy where, they have all the knowledge. It's really kind of something that you should take ownership of. In terms of when things aren't working, I think being authentic and stating like, hey, I feel stuck right now. I don't know what I can do, but I feel stuck, and kind of, I think one thing I find that people who first begin therapy is that even though you go there to kind of be open and to kind of share your story, you're still a little guarded, because this is still someone that has not established all of your trust or gained all your trust yet. So thinking of ways to be authentic, to really participate in. And like I said, it can be really hard. And it can sometimes feel like, hey, I feel worse after leaving therapy now. And that is okay to feel. You want to be uncomfortable, because sometimes feeling uncomfortable is going to get you moving in the right direction. So I would say, if you're feeling uncomfortable, if you're starting to feel like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to keep up with this, speak up, say if something's going on that you don't like, but also recognize that this might be part of the process. This might be part of the change, and change usually does not come easy.
And how long, does anyone else have a question? Because I was going to ask, how long does typically, let's say, trauma therapy, especially if people are truly engaging in trauma therapy, what would you say, just from your work that you've done, what is typically the range? And again, what does that look like? Will people spend the rest of their lives in therapy? Is it 2 weeks? So could you share a little bit of that for people who may not really know?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to those two types of trauma: acute trauma, where maybe there was just this one thing that occurred and you're just trying to work past that. So maybe that might be, it could be a couple months, it could be maybe a year, just kind of figuring out a way to process it and move past it and learn some strategies to move from it. But if you're someone who experienced complex trauma or chronic trauma, and it's really difficult, because what I find with some of the kids that I work with, they have chronic trauma and they're still living the chronic trauma. So they're coming to me, I see them, and then they're going right back into the homes in which they're exposed, re-exposed day and day. So for that, I think it's going to take some time, because sometimes it's like I'm giving them strategies on how to cope with some traumatic experiences, but with them being exposed and exposed daily, it's really hard to kind of break that cycle. But for others, I really think it depends on how open you are, how willing you're ready to do the work. And then sometimes like it might start more intense and then go, maybe you start with 2 days a week, then maybe you're just once a week, and maybe you're once a month. So you don't have to, like, your frequency can change. Like, you can really kind of take ownership in terms of how much or how little or how fast you are willing to go. You really drive. I really think that you are a driver of your therapy and of your progress. So how serious, how much commitment you have to your healing. So like that Bible verse, do you want to be healed? How serious you take that answer is really going to, I think, determine how fast or how quick, and along with other factors. So sometimes you might be working through one trauma and then another trauma occurs, so then that compounds it. So it depends. I would say it depends.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think this will be, like I said, really helpful for our leaders, because again, oftentimes, unless this is a part of your background and this is what you do, sometimes, I think they do sometimes just struggle as to what to sometimes do with the information and how can they best direct, the people that do come to them. So again, this information is extremely helpful for them to serve, but then also, as you stated, to be able to also do the same for themselves if they need to as well, as it relates to this topic. So if there aren't any other questions, any other comments, again, we want to thank you. I'm going to call Lauren back on to close us out.
Yes. All right, everyone. If you have been joining us for these 4 weeks, thank you so much. I hope that you are blessed and empowered. You're leaving with some tools, not only for yourself and your family, but I hope that you're also leaving with some tools for your members. Like if you are a pastor or a ministry leader, I'm hoping that you have enough information to be able to support and help build that resilience, as we talk today, with the people that you are serving. I want to invite everybody back next week. It is our last week in the series. However, we do have some very important people coming next week. I never can pronounce his last name right, but Johnny O is what we call him. Our Baltimore County executive will be speaking at the beginning of the session next week. Next week, we'll be focusing on coping skills again during this time. As we're approaching the holidays, during this pandemic, not being able to be with our family and friends as we usually would. We know that it has provoked and triggered a lot of feelings. People are ready for 2020 just to be over, right? And so next week is really going to support in how you can get through the holidays and prepare for 2021, again, with a fresh mindset, new eyes, new everything, but not forgetting everything that we've gone through in 2020 and using this as a lesson as well. So please join us next week. Again, it's our last week, our finale. I was going to say a season finale, our season finale of our mental health empowerment series. And again, our Baltimore County Executive, Johnny O, and his team will be joining us at 6:30, kicking off the session before our presenter comes for next week. So thank you again for you all coming tonight, and I look forward to seeing you next week.